Hi, everybody. My name is Rosie Meade, and I'd like to welcome you back to the CDJ YouTube channel. With my colleague Orla Donovan, I am one of the current co-editors of the CDJ, and this is the third in a series of online conversations that I have been recording with authors who've contributed to a recent theme section of the CDJ. That theme section focused on the theme of territorial stigmatization and its implications for community development, and it was published in spring 2021. So first of all, I'd like to encourage you and invite you to go and read the articles in that theme section. There's a really interesting diversity of contributors to it. And hopefully these introductory talks around that theme section will give you a welcoming overview of the content of the articles, and they'll encourage you to engage further with the writings and the scholarship of the authors we are speaking with. This is a really nice opportunity, I think, to virtually meet the authors and to get a sense of the ideas and interests that have informed their work. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Marcelo Lopes de Souza, who is a professor of environmental geography and political ecology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Marcelo has been an academic visitor and visiting lecturer at a number of European and Latin American universities. He has published extensively in several languages, and his research and writings cover a whole range of diverse themes that include urban theory, the spatial dimensions of social movements and political ecology, and environmental justice. And a number of those themes are discussed and explored in the article he has written for the CDJ. I'm also very happy to say that Marcelo has recently joined the International Advisory Board of the Community Development Journal. So we're going to be working together into the longer term as well, which is just fantastic. In relation to this specific series of conversations, Marcelo's article is called Sacrifice Zone, the Environment, Territory, Place of Disposable Lives. And we've made that one of the free articles on the Editor's Choice section of the Community Development Journal. The great news about that is that anybody and everybody can read that article for free whenever you want and as often as you want. So I'm strongly encouraging everybody to do so, okay? In the course of our conversation today, we're going to look a little bit more at that article and some of the ideas and concepts that Marcelo deploys within it. But we're also going to have a little bit of a conversation about community development in Brazil. So Marcelo, welcome to Cork. Welcome to the CDJ YouTube channel. It's fantastic to have you here. And thank you so much for agreeing to participate in one of these online conversations. Okay.
The same sentiment here.
Great. And you're in Rio and I'm in Cork. So again, we're having a very internationalist exchange today.
Yeah, indeed.
So Marcelo, first of all, I want to start by talking a little bit about your broader academic career and your broader body of work. You've published very extensively, and I think your work is really important. It's really important in terms of looking at issues of inequality on a kind of global scale. And as I've mentioned already, it includes, but is not limited to, analysis of themes such as planning, environmental injustice, capitalism and inequality, popular struggles and social movements. You've written about populism, urban studies, and the politics of the left. So it's quite an extensive literature that you've been working on over the course of your career. How would you best describe your own intellectual contribution? And what would you see as being the unifying themes and commitments and concerns that you explore within your research?
So, okay. Yeah. It's a huge question. So as I'm a geographer, and as a geographer, I would say I have always been interested in the relationship between social relations and geographic space since 1980s. Since I was a student, an undergraduate student. But above all, I'm particularly interested. I could put things this way. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which the concrete spatial organization influences social processes and how issues such as social justice, particularly, need to take into account not only social institutions and processes, but also the spatial organization. So, in terms of materiality, in terms of the social ecological metabolism in terms of sense of place and social spatial identities, in terms of territories, in terms of spatial networks, and so on. So, Rosie, what I want to say is that social institutions and processes don't exist in the air, in quotation marks, but on space and through space, not just on space, but through space. Let me illustrate this statement. Just as capitalism produces heteronomous, unjust, unequal spatialities, that is, segregated and self-segregated spaces, gated communities, sacrifice zones, etc. Similarly, emancipatory projects need to seriously consider the spatial dimension of reality, you know, in terms of the repertoire of strategies, tactics, and vocabulary of social movements. For example, what I have been calling in the last 20 years, insurgent spatial practices and dissident territories. You know, I have used these concepts, operationalized these concepts in a number of empirical studies, theoretical reflections, and so on. And since the 1980s, my basic concept, I'll try to summarize what I'm trying to say. For the last 40 years, my basic concept has been, what is the spatial dimension of emancipatory social practices? What is the spatial dimension of emancipatory social practices? All my involvement with subjects, issues, debates, such as the right to the city, and in recent years, the right to the planet, as I prefer to say for a number of reasons, as well as you said before, environmental justice, the governmentalization of nature, the securitization of the environment, and so on. All of that derives from this fundamental concern. That's it.
I love that concept of insurgent spatial practices, and already I can see kind of resonances with community development, you know, in its best. Maybe it
yes, of course,
an insurgent spatial practice. Could you tell us a little bit then about your interest in community development more specifically? Like, where has that interest come from, and what form does it take?
Yeah. To be totally honest, my interest in community development, in the sense that this expression is currently understood in the English-speaking world, and in particular, in the context of the community development journal, is very, 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 very recent. Very recent. However, that's the point. My interest in the problems of concrete communities, as well as the huge and complex and controversial and hot, very often hot debate around the so-called development, my interest in this regard is very old. I would say it dates back to the last 3 decades, the last 30 years at least. So look, Rosie, it must be taken into account that I come from another scientific and linguistic tradition, which is not that of the English speaking world. So at the same time, I have long been deeply involved in the reconceptualization and debate around terms such as precisely development and community. So this means that I've seen and debated certain things in a way that's perhaps strange to many European colleagues, to many Anglophone readers and colleagues. For me, for example, as for many Latin Americans, not just for me, development is an extremely problematic term. Extremely problematic, as it takes us back to 6 decades of efforts by the global north, capital, and governments to convince the global south that there is a right path, a right way, within the framework of the capitalist world system, of course, and that the countries of the global south will ultimately be rewarded if they do their homework well, like good students at school. You know, development, this term, development, has been criticized, critically examined, debated, discussed for the last 6 decades against this background, ideological and material, political, geopolitical, economic background, you know. So I come from a leftist tradition, and more particularly from the Latin American left, which has been, as I said, it has this tradition has been criticizing this approach for 5-6 decades, so-called dependency theory, and you know, but that's another interesting point. And I've been very much convinced about what I will say to you now. At the same time, however, I find it interesting not to throw the term development in the waste basket, you know. So I have tried to think of it in terms of a that's the expression I've used for almost 30 years. I've tried to think of it in terms of a social spatial development that is neither Eurocentric, nor teleological, nor economistic. That doesn't have anything to do with capitalist so-called development, but it's rather oriented to the overcoming of heteronomy, you know, and the building of self-management and direct democracy, in other words, or oriented towards autonomy in a very strong sense, you know. And this is where, at this point, where the term community finds its usefulness, as it is theoretically, both theoretically and politically, very powerful. I would say, because after all, it's about people's concrete territories, cultures, and ways of life. You know, it's a kind of epistemic turning point. You know, it's not a matter of localism, of a provincial approach to the world, because we are not neglecting this word sounds a little bit, you know, megalomaniac, but you know, we are trying to take into account the universal or the general dimension in terms of human rights and so on and so forth, but at the same time, in a much more intense way in comparison with was the tradition of the left, especially in the case of Marxism, in the case of anarchism, not entirely so, but anyway, until 20 or 30 years ago, we were trying to take into account in a much more intense way people's concrete territories, territorialities, sense of place, etc. And I think that's very powerful, very, very powerful.
I think what you said, I mean, you've captured, I think there's a sort of a lot of dilemmas in the usage of the term community development, and specifically development, but community development also. And I think even in the CDJ, even though that's the name of the journal, I think we still I think struggle a little bit with the kind of the relevance and the salience of that term, what people might think we are saying or promising by using it because of the kind of abuses and misuses of those two words. And also, I think because of the fact that we recognize that that particular terminology, community development put together, may not be used everywhere. That, you know, we speak as an international journal, but that terminology may not have currency everywhere. And it might also be deeply problematic and even offensive in certain contexts. I think that, I mean, so, and I think you've kind of really drawn that out, how particularly the word development, you know, has all sorts of really problematic baggage, to the extent about whether we should even be using that term at all is really up for negotiation. So I think from the CDJ, we use the term because it has a certain currency, there's a particular salience. I think there's a certain porosity about it. You know, you can pour lots of different kind of things into that concept of development, which is a strength and a problem, but it is both things. So I think that's maybe why we persist with it. But I think the critical reflection is really, really important. And I suppose that raises another kind of maybe slightly more practical question for me, is that in Brazil, how widely known and how widely understood is that term, community development? And if it is being used, who's using it and for what kind of different purposes are they using it?
Yep. So, this is an expression. Community development is an expression that has, for reasons I've suggested a couple of minutes before, a bad reputation, not only in Brazil, but throughout Latin America. You know, that this bad reputation is due to the fact, very concretely, is due to the fact that in 1950s, 1960s, until the 1970s, this expression, community development, desarrollo comunitario in Spanish, desenvolvimento comunitário in Portuguese, was generally, very commonly, more often than not, associated with state interventions whose purpose was devoid of a true emancipatory dimension, to say the least, you know. On the contrary, the aim was to promote social accommodation, social integration in a bad sense, you know, social stabilization, you know, ultimately cooptation, social political cooptation. So that more often than not, and that's an important point too, because it's, well, both the inspiration and funding for these initiatives came from abroad. From the 1970s, 1980s on, the criticism of state interventions gave rise to new approaches, more, I would say, more consistently, more honestly committed to popular participation. This was a time when, to some extent, very interesting discussions and approaches arose, such as, for instance, endogenous development, development from below, and the basic needs satisfaction approach, and so on. It's also a time when ideas such as those of the Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, whom you love, I know it, began to be influential, as well as so-called liberation theology, very important in Latin America in 1960s, 1970s. You know, a large part of the left, and I mean both the academic left and the party left, never had much sympathy or found much use for the expression community development in Latin America. desarrollo comunitário, desenvolvimento comunitário, as I said, these expressions had, to a large extent, still have a bad reputation. No? At least until the 1990s, in the early 2000s, when a perspective less controlled by a universalist obsession and more identified with the ways of life, as I was saying, ways of life, cultures and needs and territories of local and regional populations began to gain ground. That was the turning point. And I think Latin America is a very good example of all this, you know. So at one side, a bad reputation, but on the other side, an openness in terms of huge potential to understand that if the concept or notion of community is crucial, and if the term development can be radically refunctionalized, reinvented, then in this sense, community development could correspond to a very powerful and interesting notion, intellectually, theoretically, and politically. So
that's really interesting, and I think that whole sort of struggle that you're talking about there in relation to community development as a sort of object of state control, whereby people in communities are seen as being the targets for some kind of development and intervention, you know, that community development is done to them, do you know, you know, as opposed to done by them of their own volition. I think that has been, I suppose, a real concern in terms of the Irish experience of community development. You know, when community development is discovered as part of the social policy armory, something that, you know, we use to solve problems and we used to deny structural inequality. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's a real tension. But I think also then what you're pointing to is that when community development is reinterpreted by people for different purposes, when people themselves and their movements get hold of the concept, you know, when they begin to reimagine it in relation to ideas about democracy, autonomy, freedom, do you know, you know, freedom with others, collectivity, mutuality, then exciting things can start to happen, actually.
Yeah.
And, you know, community development can come out of that trap of government, do you know, you know, and like in the sense of the Foucauldian idea of government, where it is used as a form of governing people and as a way of problematizing people. You mentioned him in what you were saying there, our beloved Paulo Freire. And I mean, as you're well aware, internationally, Paulo Freire is repeatedly cited as a major influence on community development theory and praxis. Although sometimes what gets said about Freire and what gets done in his name are kind of like two very, very different things. And there's very kind of compromised interpretations of Freirean praxis in real life situations. I suppose I'm interested to know, what kind of influence does Freire have in Brazil today? And to what extent is his praxis being, I suppose, informing, or is his ideas about praxis, are they informing the conduct of community development or of radical social movements or political currents within Brazil at the current moment?
Yeah. So I would say that Paulo Freire's influence, who, by the way, would have turned 100 years old this year if he were alive, 100 century old. So this influence was very strong in some circles, such as the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. Circles such as the so-called, I'm not sure how I can translate that into English, but more or less like basic ecclesial communities, comunidades eclesiais de base, basic ecclesial communities, inspired by the progressive Catholic Church, you know, by liberation theology. Paulo Freire was himself representative of very radical, very progressive, but at the same time Christian approach to education, to reality, to humanity, to everything, you know. But at the same time, Paulo Freire was forced to live in exile after the military coup of 1964. So he returned to Brazil in only 1980. So, and his great book, published not in Brazil, I think the first edition was in Spanish, or it was not in English, because the first English edition was in 1970, and the Pedagogy of the Oppressed was first published in 1968. But the point is, this great book was published in Brazil only in 1974. You know, 6 years later. You know, in social movements in general, I would say that there has been a direct or very often an indirect influence from Paulo Freire for decades. But two fundamental caveats need to be made here. Number one, the pedagogy of the oppressed is not just, that's an important point from my point of view, because the meaning of the pedagogy of the oppressed has been very often reduced to education, no matter the fact that education, of course, is a crucial important issue. But the pedagogy of the oppressed is not just about education. It's a book about I would say it's a book about political philosophy. And I have the impression that a large part of the left, for this reason, never quite understood the radicalism in a positive sense, the radicality of Freire's ideas, who, as I said, despite identifying himself with the Christian socialism, he possessed a spirit that I would classify as radically left libertarian. And that means, what I'm trying to say is that for the most part of the party left, Leninism, not to mention Stalinism, Freire's radically dialogical way of conceiving not just education, but social relations and emancipation was unbearable, was dangerous, you know, from a vertical, from a hierarchical, bureaucratic point of view. And this bureaucratic, hierarchical, vertical left has been, until the end of the 20th century, the usual landscape of the left politically. So apart from anarchist experiences and fragments, but anyway, anarchism almost disappeared from political landscape after the defeat in the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War. So that, and I think that's a very important point that leads us to the conclusion that Paulo Freire has very often been more frequently mentioned than properly used or deeply understood in terms of the ultimate consequences of his ideas, you know. So and that's precisely my second caveat. You know, left-wing parties and even several social movements or social movement organizations have a vertical structure and dynamic, so that's incompatible with Paulo Freire's dialogical radicality. You know, that's why I was saying that Paulo Freire's ideas are more quoted, more cited than read, and they are more read than actually put into practice. You know, I think he's a crucial, fundamental thinker. And he's fundamental because the practical or praxical, praxis aspects of his thought are so evident. You know, you don't need many mediations in order to grasp, in order to understand what's the importance and the meaning of his dialogical approach to reality. So,
yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, because like, I suppose there is such a critique in his work of, you know, vanguardism, democratic centralism, but also from the perspective of community development is also a challenge to notions of professionalism and to expertise and to the idea of like where the directive of community development should come from. So there's like sort of, you know, there's a rich kind of mine of critique within it. But also, I mean, I found myself when like talking about Freire's work with students in particular, they're really receptive. There's a kind of it's not really a critical point. It's a kind of a simplicity about this notion of the dialogical relationship. Do you mean, you know, that how that is the foundation of, you know, like left libertarian praxis. Do you mean like that needs to be the kind of essential basis out of which we begin to start? Do you mean, you know, and to work towards some kind of better world. Do you know? And I think community development on its best days, do you know, you know, is also maybe trying to talk about that kind of dialogical relationship. Doesn't always happen, and often the kind of things that are done from a Freirean perspective or not remotely from a Freirean perspective. Do you know, you know? So I think that, you know, that concern about how the ideas are cited, but they're not observed, or they're not really, you know, the praxis is not being done while the name Freire is being bandied about. I think that is a very real problem. I suppose turning then back to the theme section and your involvement with it, it was interesting for me when we talked initially about your contribution to the theme section, because I was focusing it on this idea of territorial stigmatization, very much the kind of, as that has been, you know, envisaged and developed by Wacant and people who've come after Wacant. And I suppose what you've done in your article is really kind of encouraged us, challenged us to go beyond that, because what you've sort of said is being that we need to think in terms maybe of something a bit more fundamental, you know, a kind of a more profound kind of levels of exclusion and inequality. And so you talk about how within the global capitalist economy, people who are considered disposable, although not redundant because they're performing very important functions within the global capitalist economy, Indeed. They are condemned to life/death in what this thing called sacrifice zones. And I suppose I found that word really, and that concept really, really interesting. And I think you explain it really well in the course of the article. And so for the purposes of our listeners and our viewers, would you mind explaining to us like what you are trying to capture through your deployment of this concept of sacrifice zones? What kind of logics and forms of violence are you actually trying to draw attention to by using that particular concept? Okay.
So the concept of sacrifice zone, this concept emerged, he was proposed more or less 20 years ago in the context of discussions about environmental injustice, particularly in the United States. Many authors based in the global north, however, have, from my perspective, they have overemphasized the local level in their studies, examining how many many communities being composed of ethnic minorities and the working class are not only segregated, but also stigmatized and exposed to toxic waste and pollution and so on. That is, these locations are chosen to be polluted not only because the land there is cheaper, but because there is a tacit and cruel assumption according to which the lives of the people who live there are comparatively less important, and in the sense disposable. And it's also imagined by capitalists and governments that the ability of these people to oppose resistance is smaller. So one of the aspects that I have been highlighting is that from a global South point of view, the global South as a whole is often treated as a kind of sacrifice zone by transnational corporations and also by car countries' governments themselves. There's we can see, and therefore we can say that there's a kind of structural racism and the structural Eurocentrism that need to be analyzed not just locally, but at various levels, from local to global. So what I mean is it's not possible to disconnect the critical analysis of situations of environmental injustice at the local level from a critical analysis of the dynamics of the capitalist world system. And it's also unreasonable not to analyze the complicity of governments and the elites from peripheral countries with this situation as well. That's the historic background. The concept was not proposed originally by myself, but I've tried to develop an approach and to this situation and to the way how we could operationalize this concept from a perspective that is more connected and more compatible with the potential agenda and needs and concrete situations that we can observe, that we can experience from a global South perspective. I think that makes a difference. I think this is a look that's crucially necessary.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're saying, has the effect for me of scaling up the discussion. So, so rather than merely like focus on the local, the regional, the national, which a lot of the literature on territorial stigmatization probably does, even if it is internationalist. So even if because what it often does is it points to this phenomenon we're seeing here. It manifests here and here and here and here and here and here in all these different places. So it is ergo an international phenomenon. What I think your analysis that you're bringing is saying is that it's an international phenomenon in a more fundamental sense, in the way that it is part and parcel of the racism, the colonialism, the exploitation that is the global economic system. Do you think that's really what you're actually doing by bringing that kind of analysis? And I think it's really important in terms of scaling up. So there are local effects, there are national effects or national manifestation. There are contextual differences between places in terms of how these phenomena play out. But it is part of this bigger, deeply racist, global capitalistic system. And I think that comes through really strongly in the piece that you've written for the CDJ.
Yeah.
I suppose within that, then there are also like tacit and sometimes spoken assumptions that are made about the people who live in sacrifice zones. So in terms of the kind of grounded experience people in living in communities, what would you say are those assumptions that are being made about people in the sacrifice zones? And what then does life become like, or what is life like for people in those places?
Yeah, well, life is very often a nightmare. So, as I said, there's a widespread class stigmatization, but not just that, also racism towards populations living in those spaces. It is what I'm going to say. Maybe it will sound a little bit exaggerated, but I don't think it is, because I for me, it's clear, I have the impression that it is as if those people were, of course, inferior. And it is not just that, or as a consequence of that, it is as if they were human garbage. Human garbage. And it is as if they, as garbage, if they polluted the world. As if they polluted the world, with their poverty, with their ugliness, with their ignorance, with their barbaric customs, And because they are human garbage, what's the problem of forcing them to live in the middle of garbage, literally, and with pollution, So, I remember a moment in the famous documentary Hearts and Minds. You probably know it. I watched this documentary when I was a student, 2 centuries ago, and it's about the Vietnam War. And I mean the moment in which an American general says calmly that Vietnamese people value life less, or are less attached to life than Westerners. And what's impressive and shocking, and at the same time politically, intellectually, and politically crucial, is that it was not just that specific American general a couple of decades ago. This kind of sentiment, this kind of prejudice, this kind of racism, is totally common, widespread. It's common sense. No, in the colonial period, for several centuries, I mean specifically Latin America, because this popular say was kind in relation to Latin America. There was a serious debate about whether Red Indians and Black Africans had a soul or not, or to what extent they would be like intermediaries between two human beings and beasts. And I'm trying to recall a popular say, which was very common 3-4 centuries ago, according to which, again, I'm not sure how I can translate it into English in a proper way, but it's under the equator line, everything is allowed. There is no sin south the equator line, so everything is allowed. There was a serious debate in the context of Catholic Church about the soulless or not soulless nature of Red Indians and Black Africans. So that this kind of prejudice, of racism, permeates and influences a whole imaginary throughout the centuries. It's just not invented 100 years ago or 3, 4, 5 generations ago. So what I try to say is that, from my point of view, this mindset hasn't changed in a sense. Perhaps, or surely, it has been modified in terms of form at a time that's our time, when hypocrisy has also become more or less institutionalized. But the essence in terms of racism, of Eurocentrism, of devaluation of black skin and otherness, that's still there, you know. And you can imagine how people, because they are not stupid and they are not passive, they are educated in the context of our institutions to passivity, but they are very often not passive. They react, they respond, and they fight. So you can imagine how they because they, you know, it's a matter of daily life experience for them that white or so-called white ruling classes, how these people, working class and Afro-Brazilians or mestizos and so on and so forth, in the favelas at the peripheries of the large cities, on the countryside, the traditional populations and original peoples, and so on and so forth, how they are perceived and treated.
Yeah.
You know, that's an everyday life experience for all of them. Lack of water, pollution, lack of sanitation. These are the material and spatial expressions of lack of respect, of lack of acknowledgement of their humanity. So, but, you know, let me come back to your other question. In terms of the views of the people who live in those spaces, you know, I think nonetheless that it's too risky to make generalizations in terms of they react this way or they respond that another way. Because, you know, Rosie, after all, we are dealing with different, not just different countries, we are dealing with different continents, different cultures, different countries, different cities. Moreover, the political situation also has some influence, or a huge influence, and concrete situations vary greatly in terms of expectations, political culture, etc. You know, people's attitudes range from sometimes fatalism and resignation for religious reasons or whatever, to indignation and to a predisposition to fight, to confront, to oppose, you know. But I know that saying this doesn't clarify anything, you know. Or what I'm trying to say is it's necessary to analyze each concrete case in order to avoid a priori generalizations, because otherwise we run the risk of observing, and that's intellectual and political, very important point from my point of view. We would run the risk of observing not what people, concrete people on the ground, are doing and saying, but what we would like them to do and say. That has been a serious mistake on the part of the left very often. And of course, very often people don't react as we would like them to react to the challenges. And then we say they are alienated, they are ignorant, poor people, they can't understand their objective situation, and so on and so forth. Of course, lack of perception or lack of information and ideology, all of that is surely part of the problem. But I think one very central aspect of academia's arrogance, and I'm speaking not about the right, I'm speaking about the left, it's precisely that. We project our desires and wishes and expectations onto the people on the ground, but we are very often not sensitive enough to say that their lives, in terms of difficulties, in terms of obstacles, in terms of many aspects, are not our lives. And so, the point is also the problem of the supremacy of theory and of a praxis. You know, so that we love our theories, and our theories are developed in a bubble, and we love these bubbles and niches. These are our comfort zones. That's a kind of you know, masturbation, our alienation, political alienation, you know. And this problem was already a fact 100 years ago or 80 years ago. But nowadays, we can see bubbles inside bubbles, tribes speaking different languages. And all these languages are unintelligible for 90% of the population in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, on the countryside in Bolivia, and so on and so forth. Unintelligible. So what's the usefulness of this kind of approach or theory? I would say nothing in terms of praxis, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worse than useless, do you know what I mean? In the sense that it's actually damaging and harmful, because it, you know, it creates division, it creates sense of elites, do you know what I mean? You know, like it you know, makes people on the left, you know, seem irrelevant, stupid, do you know what I mean? You know, like beyond redemption in terms of, you know what I mean? You know, like broader constituencies of people. So it's really damaging. I think you've done a really great job there in terms of also evoking the kind of historical continuities in discourse and practices around racism and exclusion, and also the kind of violence of it, the way that it's symbolic, it's discursive, but crucially, it's material as well. I mean, people experience this kind of violence as a material, you know, material lack. They experience it as, you know, it experience it in where they live. It kind of goes through so many different dimensions. So it's powerful stuff. You know what I mean? And there is a historical continuity about it. But perhaps what's happening today is systems and institutions have gotten cleverer about how they present it, how they construct it, how they manage it, how they dispose, do you know what I mean? How they dispose of these relations. And you know what I mean? You know, well, on the one hand, deny any kind of racist intention, but on the other hand, their practice suggests something very, very different. And I thought one of the things that was very interesting in your analysis is you point consistently to the role of the state and capital. Okay, so you're referencing both within and the kind of and their interrelationship within this global capitalist system as creating the conditions for life in the sacrifice zones. And one of the things for example, you make reference to is that the zoning is an active process done by the state. Do you know what I mean? So the creation of these zones is done by the state. Yep. And I think sometimes in community development, you know, we can sort of end up like, we want the state to be, you know what I mean? We want to be with the state or part of the state, or we want the state to solve these problems. So by highlighting that dynamic between the state and capital, you're raising kind of a fundamental question for us, I think. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that relationship between the state and capital as you see it, and how it manifests itself through the creation of the sacrifice zones?
Yeah, so look, as much as it has become fashionable to say that the nation state is over, the end of the nation state, etc., this is an ideological and neoliberal interpretation or neoliberal wish, neoliberal project. But in fact, the nation state, the capitalist state apparatus, okay, has shrunk from the point of view of the interests of the poor in terms of public health, in terms of educational services, and so on. But the state apparatus, and that's the point, the state apparatus continues to be fundamental with regard to not just to repression services for the benefit of the ruling classes, with regard to guaranteeing against breach of contracts, with regard to the regulation of land use, etc. So, in terms of our subject, now in terms of land use regulation, despite flexibilizing instruments of neoliberal inspiration, zoning, as you mentioned, zoning, and state subsidies as well, in the form of tax exemptions, for instance, they all continue to be very important instruments for large companies, for transnational companies, for big business, through the implementation, in terms of the concrete needs of big capital, so that you can see that the complicity of the state apparatus in terms of the implementation, or by means of the implementation of industrial districts, or another example, lenient environmental legislation is crucial for the for profits, especially if you take into account that we are talking about peripheral or semi-peripheral countries, in relation to Brazil, in relation to Mexico, in relation to India, in relation to South Africa, in relation to Argentina. Governments here are expected to be, in quotation marks, of course, to be flexible in terms of environmental legislation, in terms of regulation, control, because otherwise the profits are not so high as they should be, So that you see that the same company in Germany or in England or United States behave in a way that is totally different from the way how it operates and behave in Mexico or in Brazil in terms of respect towards people, in terms of accepting and not transgressing legislation, environmental legislation, in terms of labor rights. There has been a lot of transgressions in this regard as well. It's a shame. It's a scandalous situation, So, well, in any capitalist country, the state apparatus, the capitalist state, is not simply the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, as Lenin said, but state apparatus, it's still and surely, ultimately, heteronomous institution, and the interests that tend to prevail in the long run, and the interests that dictate the way how the governments, obviously in the case of centrist or right-wing governments, but even in the case of social democratic governments and so on, this way is dictated ultimately by the capitalist interests, at least in the long run. Of course, that's way how capitalism reproduces itself, even if it has to constantly adapt to new circumstances.
There's an interesting debate going on in Ireland at the moment, actually, because internationally there's this move towards a kind of reconciling rates of corporation tax, so that there would be kind of a single rate, kind of a universal rate across the globe. And the Irish government is holding out against that. It's sort of saying, we want to have a lower corporation tax rate in Ireland than the one that's probably coming in. So 12.5% versus the 15%. And and the kind of phenomenon you're describing it's similar, actually. And I think it's coming from a similar place, a sense of a peripheral economy within the world capitalist system, and sort of, wanting to be seen to bend over backwards, in order to facilitate global capitalism. I think that's part and parcel of actually what's going on there. And the nation and the Irish state and the Irish government identifying our de facto interests as people with the kind of interests of American corporations is what they're actually talking about there. So I think it's kind of it's a different manifestation, but I think it's part of a very similar type of problem whereby the state is over-identifying with, global capital, and sees its role as about greasing the wheels and ensuring that, it gets its way. And national interest being then accordingly defined according to those criteria.
Yeah. I think it was Richard Nixon who said, or Henry Kissinger perhaps, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
This slogan is, it's fantastic.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we might want to scream when we hear it, but there's also, in terms of the way nation states are acting, there's truth in what he's saying, in terms of the perception. In the title of your article, and I think it's interesting, it's a particularly interesting title to me, you use the concept of environment, territory, place, okay? So there's like little dashes between those individual words, and that's very crucial to your argument. So it's not just in the title, but it's also, you build that kind of triad of words into your argument. I suppose I'd like to just talk a little bit about, like, what would you see as being the theoretical and political significance of linking those words together in that way? What are you trying to achieve by doing so? Really, territory, environment, territory, place. When you put them together, what are you seeking to convey?
Yeah. So many geographers have unfortunately lost sight of the importance of integrating different dimensions of reality. In particular, they began to consider in 1970s that it was not worth trying to produce analysis that integrate social relations and geobiophysical processes. That is what we usually call nature. So I can't deal with this subject, the discussion here, but the fact is geographers did it in 1970s, 1980s, believing it to be the only way they could be accepted as true social scientists. I think it was a trap, a self-built trap. Anyway, this was a mistake. And the result of that mistake was that there has been a neglect of what Karl Marx called social metabolism, and what you could call perhaps more precisely, social ecological metabolism. So, valuing the concept of environment, I mean, understood in a broader sense, and not just restricted to first nature. Valuing the concept of environment in this broader sense, means valuing the social ecological metabolism. That is, valuing problems such as the social production of environmental disasters. The social production of environmental disasters, because they are not, or 99% of the cases, they are not natural disasters. They are environmental disasters in a very broader sense, such as the negative health effects of environmental pollution as well, such as the relationship between residential segregation on the one side and the risk of landslides or floods or wherever on the other side, and so on and so forth. So integrating this concept of environment, so widely understood, not just as first nature, not just as natural environment, but in terms of social ecological metabolism, with the concept of territory, which has to do with the projection of power relations onto space, and with the concept of place, which has to do with the dimension of culture, of symbolism, with feelings of belonging to concrete spaces. A Sino-American geographer, E. Futuan, called the term 50 years ago, topophilia. I love this word, topophilia. It also has to do the concept of place with social spatial stigmatization, for instance, as well as with social spatial identities. I think this integration, conceptually, theoretically, and methodologically, of environment, territory, and place, is very powerful. And for me, it's very much a kind of being a true geographer without renouncing my identity as a social researcher as well. I think it's a matter of win-win. So this is so that's the theoretical, conceptual, methodological key to comprehensively analyzing the tragedy of the sacrifice zones, because they are there. We need these tools. We need to examine this social, ecological, metabolic side, the territorial aspect, because people are being deterritorialized in the same context in which big capital territorialize themselves, invade and occupy spaces, actually places, which have been and which were already the context, the framework of those people's, hundreds of thousands of people's everyday lives. So that's I think that's the reason why this integration is very powerful. We have a tradition. Well, I said something about geography's scene in the 1970s, 1980s. On the other side, we have a tradition in sociology and in most other social sciences of neglecting geobiophysical processes. Anthropology has been, to a large extent, the most important exception. But look at economics, look at sociology, look at political science, as if the due consideration of geobiophysical processes would run the risk of incurring or accepting environmental determinism. Not necessarily, not at all. We have realized that this divide between social sciences and natural sciences must be overcome, that we need build bridges, And I think geography has a potential role, in spite of the fact that many geographers have deserted the battle. And in order to become, as I said before, true social scientists, they have neglect, many of them at least, they have neglect this very important side of materiality. How could we see materialists, in sense of historical materialists or dialectical materialists, without paying attention to materiality? And geobiophysical processes are a constitutive part of materiality. From my point of view, it's relatively simple.
I mean, I really hear what you're saying, because I suppose my own background is in sociology, and I certainly have a sense that for a long period of time, that there was a tendency to view people and peoples as people who happened to be plonked in or on places. Do you know? And that it was the people that were interesting as in some kind of abstracted sense from the places, but that the place had nothing else to contribute to that. It was a sort of it just happened to be a kind of a point of difference, but it didn't really have any significance. Yeah. And I suppose one of the exciting things,
just as a frame, a location.
Exactly. It just happened. It could be anywhere,
Yeah.
And that one of the exciting things I think has happened has been the kind of challenge that certain critical tendencies in geography have done is brought into sociological awareness a growing recognition of the importance of territory, place, environment, like bringing those. And I think you've articulated really well in that paper, but I think it has been a real problem in sociology, and I think that part of this problem with sociology is facing as a kind of a discipline in the contemporary world relates to that perhaps literal lack of groundedness, in terms of the kind of spatial relations as well. Okay. I suppose that brings us on to the kind of idea of like real life context and real life situations. Yeah. And you and your students have been doing some work in Santa Cruz and in Rio de Janeiro, where you've been engaging directly with communities that have been experiencing issues of pollution and environmental hazard. You want to tell us a little bit about that work that you've been doing in that community in Santa Cruz?
So, Rosie, Santa Cruz is actually just one of the places we have been studying for several years. So in other words, it's one of the examples of environmental injustice that we have been examining for more than 20 years. So where is Santa Cruz, or what's Santa Cruz? Santa Cruz is a huge district located on the outskirts of the city of Rio de Janeiro, of the municipality of Rio de Janeiro. Santa Cruz is a district basically inhabited by the working class, and in which highly polluting, highly contaminating industrial companies started to settle many years ago. So the main one of these industries, factories, is a huge steel plant, which has been responsible for air and water pollution, causing damage to the health of residents, and practically eliminating the artisanal fishing that existed on the banks of the Sepetiba Bay. Santa Cruz is located on the so-called west zone of Rio, and this bay, Sepetiba, is the name. Sepetiba Bay plays a very important role there for fishermen, in economic terms, So, and well, the way in which my collaborators and I always approach these situations, not only in Santa Cruz is one of the examples, is always to try to first of all, to understand what's going on, both in terms of objective problems and in terms of the perception of those affected, So, but at the same time, we always try to help in some way which is unfortunately not always possible for several reasons, because of difficulties, because of some kind of resistance or suspicion or whatever. Then the situations can be very different, the fact is that contrary to what we would like, what a team of researchers from a university can do is usually, as I very often say, is usually like a drop of water in the ocean, for several reasons. So that means that without the active cooperation of those affected, and often without the partnership of NGOs, the tragedy is that there aren't so many NGOs which are truly reliable and that's another discussion. But the fact is that since many years, many NGOs became, as I say, quasi non-governmental organizations, because they depend on fundings from private companies and very often from the state apparatus itself. So that's in this context, in this sense. So, but the fact is that we as a team of academic researchers, we are dependent of this partnership with NGOs, with public prosecutors. The public prosecutor's office, in Portuguese, Ministério Público. I think it's an acceptable way to translate it. The public prosecutor's office, the public defender's office, sometimes Congress people at the municipal and at the state level. Without these partnerships, researchers alone can do very little, in terms of what people ultimately expect, that is concrete change and not just nice talks, nice words, because we usually encounter people, we meet people who are really very nice. They are very receptive. They cooperate with us. And it's very often so that we have a bitter feeling that they are much more useful to us than we are useful for them. One of the ways we have tried to cooperate with them is to facilitate contacts with public prosecutors or public defenders, some parliament members at municipal level, at the state level. Because as a university, what we can do, apart from, studies about concrete contamination, concrete pollution, which can be used to denounce the real problems. But apart from that, we can't change nothing. So, and it's sad that we see precisely in relation to this concrete case of Santa Cruz that even those people who perhaps could change something, they also can't change almost nothing. They are more or less powerless. The fines and the pressure from the public prosecutor's office, the concrete result of that, after 10 years, almost nothing. So it's that has been for us at one side a very important experience in terms of our own powerlessness as academics, but on the other side, it's an important illustration of the huge difficulty precisely in a global South country to change things, even if a part of the state apparatus, public prosecutor's office, public defender's office, Congress people, environmental regulation agencies, etc., recognize that there's something rotten, something wrong with those companies. But, you know, that's capitalism. It's worthwhile. It's interesting to transgress and to violate norms, and you pay fines and you pay for this, but you still you keep violating, you keep transgressing norms because it's economically interesting. You know, that's the logic of the whole thing. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said raises some really interesting questions, I suppose, for me, I often, and often we have these discussions with students about, the importance of research as emancipatory research. And, and often, we make very puffed up claims about what, the good we do through our scholarship. And I suppose what you're doing there is you're really kind of giving me kind of pause to think about that and what, the limitations and the fact that when we are researching inequality and oppression, it is in struggle. Struggle is ongoing, and struggle is difficult, and struggle, meets with reversals, and it meets with obstacles, and it is bloody hard. Do you know? And so the kind of these kind of generic claims which are often made within academia for how we liberate and emancipate through our research, we really need to be much more modest about that kind of thing and really acknowledge the kind of limitations of our own interventions. I suppose just based on building on what you said there, in terms of the resistance in places like Santa Cruz, to what extent has there been resistance? To what they're going through and to their experience, and have they had any successes in that regard?
As the Germans say, "Jein." Yes and no at the same time. Jein. So Santa Cruz is an example, precisely as I was saying, of the huge difficulty in reversing situations of this type, especially in countries like Brazil, of the capitalist periphery. So for 10 years, the residents of Santa Cruz have had support, not only from some research institutions. I mean, not only us, but also especially from the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, which deals with biomedical research, but also from NGOs, especially from a specific NGO, which is very important there, from the Public Prosecutor's Office, from the Public Defender's Office, as I said before, etc. But none of this was or has been enough to reverse the problem. So in 2017, after several fines and other sanctions imposed by the Public Prosecutor's Office of the state of Rio de Janeiro, the steel company, I mean, ThyssenKrupp, Companhia Siderúrgica do Atlântico, this German steel company was sold by the Germans to another transnational company based in Luxembourg. But what has been the main result of this? The main result of this has been that the company's strategy, that's interesting, has become more intelligent or more flexible, aiming at attempts to divide and co-opt the local population through, for instance, internship programs for young people, things like that, However, in a sense, nothing has changed. Nothing. In fact, it's not the residents who have been successful. I'm sorry to say that, but the company that seems to be having some success in dividing the residents by means of this clever strategy. As we say, we have discussed this. We have followed all these changes, and we say that's the difference between a German approach, so hard and and Italian French. So the Italian French company based in Luxembourg. That's so they are clever. So the problems for the Germans were so important that member of the Grünen, of the Greens, the German Greens of the parliament in Germany, came to Rio to inspect in loco the situation, to talk to people here. And so in the course of time, the situation developed to a more or less scandalous one in Germany.
Okay.
German public opinion is very much sensitive to environmental, especially social environmental problems and concerns, etc. And so, but they were not able to do what has been done since 2017, which is this old Roman strategy, divide e impera, divide and rule. So that they have divided, co-opted, and divided the population. Population suffer. They still suffer from several diseases, but on the other side, look, it's really cruel, because if you offer some very modest possibilities to a population who is to a large extent unemployed and very poor, that there's an appeal there, that there is some seduction power there. That's it, yeah. So that's why I'm saying that when ThyssenKrupp became, that's the new name, Ternium Brazil in 2017, the management became much more intelligent, precisely from a capitalist and strategic point of view, which doesn't mean, of course, that the residents were winning. And with the pandemic, the self-organization of the residents became even more difficult, know. So this is not an epic example of a successful fight. Very much on the contrary, unfortunately. That I'm not saying that we can't see several efforts, several initiatives in terms of resistance and self-organizing there, but the fact is that the obstacles are huge. The strength of the local community, even in the context of the help from outside, I mean the public prosecutor's office, the public defender's office, NGOs, universities, etc., is very limited.
Yeah. I mean, in these conversations, we've been really one of the things we have been trying to look at is this idea of resistance, and and really trying to emphasize the possibility of it. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's important not to romanticize that. It's not, resistance can happen, but that doesn't mean it's successful. Do you know? And it is occurring against the obstacles of huge inequality.
Yeah.
And the ways through which capital is mobile. It's mobile ideologically. It's mobile in terms of how it kind of manages dissent and difference, and those practices of buying people off, separating them out. These are hard and well-established practices. So I think even though the story you're telling us is not a happy one, it's not something that's going to necessarily make us feel more optimistic about it. But nonetheless, it's important and it's realistic, and we need to recognize that resistance doesn't always succeed, and we need to be, cognizant of that fact.
Yeah.
I suppose then, just like the final question that I want to put to you, given what we've just been saying, What would you see, if any, as the potential for community development in a context like this? Where could community development fit in? Can it be, for example, articulated with struggles for economic justice? Or is maybe community development part of the problem here? So what, if anything, could community development do or contribute to the praxis in a context like this?
I would say that community development that cannot be articulated with struggles for social and environmental justice simply doesn't deserve this name. What would be the concrete content of a community development if not justice? That's my question. Let me say that I understand environmental justice as a specific aspect of social justice, by the way. So for professional reasons, as a geographer, I wouldn't be too concerned about the label community development in itself. What's crucial from my perspective is the content of the proposals, of the strategies, tactics. After all, Rosie, community development will be what we make of it, right? So that the important thing is to be clear that radically emancipatory perspective will not be achieved using state interventions and vertical forms of organization, but based on self-management and self-organization, valuing concrete struggles at the local and regional level, without never forgetting the national and international context, I would say. But what concerns me, Rose, is the fact that the number of challenges is increasing, not diminishing. Let me have a final, I promise you, brief look at Santa Cruz. There's something that is almost impossible to say here because it's a matter of personal safety. It's a matter of the safety of my family. But look, Santa Cruz is one of the spaces, not just at the outskirts of Rio, which is dominated, controlled, which have been territorialized by paramilitary militias. Mm-hmm. They are not drug dealers. Mm-hmm. In fact, they have taken control increasingly of the drug dealers' territories in the last 20 years. These paramilitary militias, they are formed by military policemen, ex-military policemen, firefighters, ex-firefighters, and they sell protection. They extort local business very often. They have very often, they began 20, 25 years ago extorting drug dealers, and they have increasingly replaced drug dealers themselves. But not just that, they sell protection. And there's some evidence that even those transnational corporations must find some arrangement, some compromise in order to avoid problems. And in the context of space, at the outskirts of metropolises, where policing has always been absent or at least insufficient, the militias provide, these paramilitary militias provide some kind of private security services for those enterprises, for those companies. You know, that also means that for us, especially for us, because yeah, for public prosecutor's office, not very much, because it would be scandalous to kill a public prosecutor or to kidnap a public defender. But for poor guys like us from university, doing field work, interacting with people, and I could give you, there's no time, of course, and it's not necessary, but I could give you some very concrete examples of what I'm saying. Doing field work, interacting with people, etc., can be dangerous. Not, yes, dangerous, and it's very unpleasant because we have the impression, in fact, we are very much sure about that. When we are there for a meeting, for talks, for interviews, for activities together with the population, we are being always watched. You know, that's just one example. This kind of problem didn't exist 30, 25 years ago. You know, new layers of challenges, new layers of problems. Another one, new Pentecostalism, Christian fundamentalism. That's the reverse of liberation theology. The pastors, they tell people, be quiet, respect the state, respect the governments. To Caesar, what belongs to Caesar? To God, what belongs to God? That's a huge force beyond some signs, sometimes, of an increasing acceptance on the part of many poor people of injustice. So the election of Bolsonaro is just one of the results of all these trends. So, sorry for talking so much.
Well, I think we will leave it there, but this has been a fascinating conversation. And even though it's ended on quite a depressing, in a depressing way or in a chastening way, because I think what you're doing is you're challenging any notions of inevitable progress, any sense that, like that we are guaranteed, like what you're, I suppose, reminding me is that struggle needs to happen and it needs to continue to happen. But, we are not guaranteed successes, and there will be reversals, and there will be obstacles in our way. But nonetheless, we need to persevere in terms of finding ways of making connection, building solidarity, developing our own sense of autonomy in collaboration with other people. So that's really what I think the message you've conveyed by what you've said. I'm going to stop recording there now. So Marcela, we'll continue after this, but thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. And I will encourage everybody who's been listening to this to read the paper and to engage more with Marcelo's work, because I think we'll find it really, really useful in terms of developing a more thoughtful, nuanced understanding of a kind of left libertarian conception of community development and its possibilities.
Thank you, Rosie.